So what we are discussing today is queer and asexuality, and is saying here that God saved the queer. Really, the whole lecture is going to be about that. It's not so about God who's supposed to save the queer, but more about devil, in my view. So the whole this time, I will try to prove you that it's not the God who's supposed to save the queer, if they need to be saved even, but it's more about devil who has to do with with queer, and also asexuality. So those are that's the last topic I wanted to discuss with you, like during the last lecture, because those are my two hopes to step out of the discourse of sexuality. But there are weak hopes, because still we will see that queer and asexuality, they still have to do with the with basically discourse of sexuality. So they're still largely framed within discourse of sexuality, but it's still much better than other phenomena, even maybe to a certain extent more promising than phenomena of fluidity and maybe LGBT, idea of LGBT. And I'll remind you, the main challenge for me was to follow Foucault in his criticism of the discourse of sexuality, which is dominant and still is kind of remains dominant, maybe in modified form, not the same way like it was before, but it's still we still tend to perceive it as something that tells us truth about who we are, because we normally associate the idea of figuring out who we are with figuring out what is our gender and what is our sexual orientation. And when we are asked to tell truth about who we are, this is the most obvious connotation. The truth who we are is gender, and truth who we are sexual orientation. Like we associate, we still remain in a framework where we define ourselves through this discourse of sexuality, through a paradigm of sexuality. And Foucault idea, what Foucault did in his history of sexuality, he actually challenged this discourse, and he claims that one day maybe we will start to laugh, we'll be able to laugh at the idea that sexuality was so important, that it's somehow this aspect of life start to be seen as such that defines who we are, as some sphere of life that keeps all the secrets about who we are, and we kind of associate mostly with this discourse. And also the problem for Foucault with discourse of sexuality, that it connects with confession. So when we confess, maybe already not now, but still don't talk about maybe sexuality that much now. Maybe we talk about sexuality in a modified form now. But when you confess your sins, meaning that you tell in truth, church, for example, in traditional Christian society, you would normally confess some sexual deviation, or describe this sinful aspect of your life. And this is also the means of control, right? The whole apparatus of confession. And now we see it more or less remnants of confession in psychoanalytic practice. We can see it in medical practice, that you have to, it's not to that extent now about sexuality, but still psychoanalysis, as we were discussing, remains largely based on the discourse of sexuality. So it's still a topic to discuss, still some truths to expose, and some still perceived this idea that it's sinful and you have to confess in it. And it's still within the politics of emancipation. It's still what is emancipated is normally identification on the within the sexual discourse. That is the discourse of what gender, emancipation of women, and the discourse of sexual orientation, like emancipation of LGBT. So it's still largely concentrated within the discourse of sexuality. And I think that queer has a potential to kind of step out of a discourse of sexuality. And it's actually largely based on queer theory. It's largely relies on Foucault. I mean, queer theory largely relies on Foucault methodology. As you know, because most of you read Foucault. As you know, Foucault's method is critical. He follows Nietzsche in his critical genealogical method, or what he calls archaeology of knowledge. Do you know what it means? Do you remember even what Foucault archaeology means? Okay, you're tired. So critical method, we know what critical mean when we criticize something, when we doubt something, when we are suspicious about some stuff that is presented to us as obvious as something that goes without saying. Genealogical or archaeology means that we do research on, Foucault does research on something that is unspoken. There is some definitions, some knowledge that is presented in a spoken form, something that is told, something that was said, but also it's based normally something that is not spoken about, and that's the most interesting thing, right? Something that is obvious, is so obvious that it's not necessary to talk about it. But if you start to discuss, start your research on this invisible side, it can actually tell you more than the side which is visible, of the visible side of knowledge. So this is the critical genealogical method, which is similar, which critical theory adopts from Foucault. And also what is important is knowledge power, the relationship, the way Foucault presents them. And I'm reminding you that power, it's not that some group of people which is on the top of hierarchy in society creates knowledge and then disseminates it. For Foucault, power is not like a group of bad guys on the top of hierarchy. It's more about Nietzschean term that represents the power, the relationship within society. They're not necessarily hierarchical. They are just present. It's some invisible forces that defines society, that generates a certain form of society. So those are power, this invisible side, those powers that create society, that form society, that form who we are, our identities, and set the general framework of self-identification, the general framework of knowledge certain society and certain historical period relies on, right? It's not that power, meaning bad guys, create knowledge and impose knowledge, although we can also see these tendencies. But it's also about internalized power, like it's a certain knowledge from society that we start to see as our own knowledge, that we start to self-identify with, and we believe that this is our own. So we believe in it. It's mostly the most powerful power. The strongest power is not that one that is imposed from somewhere outside, right, by those bad guys that want to propagate something, want to believe in it. But it's actually internalized power. It's something within you that you believe, that you by yourself, by your own will, free will, tend to define yourself without questioning why am I doing it. So now the most important knowledge power relationship is, or what we can call a paradigm, is heterosexual normativity, and this makes us define by our own will, define ourselves as, first of all, through within this within the framework of sexuality, right? Not because we can't say that it was imposed on us, but this is what we naturally, not naturally, but do because we think that it's the right thing to do. So this is power. This is more about power, a relationship. And for example, this knowledge power relationship creates social categories through which we with which we can identify. And one of the examples is homosexual people, men, normally. So even though now it's a category emancipated or in the process of emancipation that we some of us tend to identify with as seen as identities initially, it derived from the phenomena of sodomy. So there was the phenomena of sodomy that is described in the Bible, and not only in the Bible, it exists, it was perceived as sinful behavior, just the behavior, right? And from this phenomena of sodomy as a sinful behavior within the Christian, Judeo-Christian perspective, now within the present framework, maybe the framework which is previous to the present one, was taken to, was transformed, turned into the category of personhood. So category of identity, which is weird process, right? Why the idea that man had some phenomena of sodomy transformed into identity, into the category to personify certain group of people. So initially, homosexuals were listed, were identified as those deviants, as perversions. It was in already when the medical discourse and discourse of psychiatry started to be established. It was defined as deviations. Those people were identified with this phenomena. So, and personified as homosexual, that is deviants. And now later on within the present framework, we more or less in the progressive world still preserve the idea that it's a personification, that this defines a certain group of people, like their personality, maybe the key feature of their personality. We can call certain people homosexuals, even though maybe they well, it's not the most important part of their life, right? This phenomena. And now we are trying to emancipate them, but first to emancipate them, we have to define them as such. So we still kind of, even though by trying to emancipate them is still a process of oppression here, because this is we still define them as they were initially defined and claimed to be deviants. Again, it's too complicated, but still. So the others, what I like the most from Foucault is he's saying, let us pervert good sense, and he actually wrote this as a part of in discussion with Deleuze, as in part of introduction to Deleuze work. And so they both use the idea of perversion, the term. Foucault is post-structuralist and Deleuze is also post-structuralist. And pervert here means to, so good sense means common sense, like sense that we share. This, the obvious part, the ordered reality. And Foucault, we can explain what his method is by claiming that this archaeology or genealogy or just creating or generating a new sense is possible only by perverting good sense. So by seeing it from some weird angle, seeing it as not obvious, seeing it as in a perverted form. So that can be seen as a description of Foucault's method, and actually Deleuze's method. Deleuze is even more perverted, I think, in this, in his language and in his type of vision how he see realities. So what they both do, what those post-structuralists share, is this weird perspective on the world that that doubts accepted forms of perception of reality, of history, of history, social reality, and doubt the obvious. You will also, it is also not rare for theorists of or critics of queer theory to claim that that it's queer theory is part of or type of postmodernism. You have one of the articles in your reading list for this week also actually argues that it's queer theory can be explained as a part of postmodernism. Postmodernism, most of you know as well, Foucault normally considers, so those post-structuralists like Foucault, Deleuze, Derrida, they are considered postmodernists. And what defines postmodernism is the rejection of validity of grand narratives. Do you remember what are those grand narratives are? Okay, you don't. So grand narratives are those big stories, the narratives, or maybe we can call them paradigms that explain the reality and explain reality in its all in its aspects, or it's perceived, something that is perceived as self-obvious, or some imposed truth that is accepted in society. So the present paradigms through which we, the story which we tell each other and the story that we use to explain the world that has some coherence in it. For example, the theological story, the Judeo-Christian story can be defined as grand narrative that was for a long time, and maybe still now we have some part of it remain in our explanation of how world functions, that the picture of the world that includes God and the concept of God, concept of sin, stuff like that. So it's grand narrative, certain story that we use that explains everything, that claims to be able to explain everything, like relationship with people, with each other, the government, everything, and our identity, for example, is it sinful, if it's not sinful. So it's a grand narrative, and postmodernism is actually something that rejects or doubts those grand narratives. So those comfortable stories that we habitually use to describe the world, which are comfortable because they are habitual, they are something that were tested by a certain generation and in our experience of life experience, and it's not really doesn't feel that good to doubt them. And the other way to explain what is postmodernism, and you probably also know, is Thomas Kuhn theory of scientific revolution. So it's mostly about science, like those revolutions within the scientific discourses, within the sphere of science, but it can also be claimed as just in more general scale, that is just a switch of the switch of paradigms. So he claims that Kuhn claims that scientific knowledge, even though it now functions as the well, it's a way, it's a grand narrative, a certain paradigm that suggests that it has the access to truth. And this is how we perceive. Nietzsche already writes that there is something in theology, in science, there is something theological, like we still preserve God, and God for us is the idea that it's the scientists serve the truth, right? There's still idea that there is something we are not allowed to doubt, and scientists have these keys to a certain truth. But actually, Thomas Kuhn doubts that it's the truth in a last instance, because he claims that those paradigms in science, they actually change, and the paradigm of a science of a certain historical period will not coincide with a vision, with a paradigm, scientific paradigm of a different period. And so they are not they're not possessors of a truth in the last instance. Is something that is subject of change as well. So he claims that members of mature scientific community is like the typical character in Orwell's 1984, is the victim of history rewritten by the powers. So still, as we remember from Foucault, in a similar way, he described this power-knowledge relationship. Maybe one tends probably to interpret this as the power that it's imposed by certain guys, as Vladislav. But still, I suggest that we see it from the perspective that is just that it's just the power that exists within the framework of certain scientific paradigm. It's not that it's imposed by bad guys. It's just the perspective, same as a common sense perspective exists. And science is not a saint in this way too. Yes, Vladislav.
I wanted to ask about the word mature. Does it mean that as more mature the community become, as much the risk of being exposed to this history rewritten by the powers?
Yeah, it's true. It's a bit there is maybe ageism here, but it solely almost depends on maturity, because so Kuhn's idea that in revolution in science there are these revolutions, processes of revolution that are lead the shift of a paradigm. And the problem with mature established science is that they share common, they are established, that's the problem. They share certain knowledge, they agree with each other, they feel comfortable in this scientific paradigm with the language they share. And everything else, everything that doesn't share their worldview, they consider as not scientific. They will tell you that it's weird, it's not, they will not give you that like recognition within this field, some kind of titles and scientific stuff. So because you need to follow their lead, right? You need to follow their lead, share their knowledge, learn what they know, then you will be part of scientific community. And but for Kuhn, exactly this weird stuff that doesn't coincide with, like for example, Darwinian idea of evolution can be seen as the paradigm shift that was seen as a deviation from theological perspective, and was seen as a weird within the established, even by Darwin himself, it was seen as sinful within the established mature paradigm, right? And the wouldn't accept it precisely because it's established. But then the revolution happened, and the new paradigm that was seen weird from the perspective of established paradigm started to be a leading one. Like currently, the perspective of evolution is the leading one, and it's not seen weird anymore. And on the contrary, so it is established, we have research, we have shared language, but the new shrift is coming, right? Something new is coming, something that is now seen weird, not scientific. Well, but we know that this thing changed. We know that something that seems very clever, something that seemed very clever now, for example, the theological perspective and like obvious thing, there is God, God created the world, and we know this from Bible. Like I know, I pray to God and I feel he's present, therefore God is present. So this was obvious things, and then the theory of evolution didn't fit in this perspective of the world. It was seen weird. Now we got used to perspective of evolution. We developed a scientific language framework about the evolution. We are comfortable more or less within this frame, but all the perspective that fit for their time were seen normal, comfortable, clever for at that time. But then from this perspective, from current perspective or from future perspective, they just seem dumb, right? And which means that everything we think so clever, we think is so clever now, including the concept of evolution, by the way, and all the most progressive knowledge, one day will be dumb, right? One day people will come who will doubt it and say that it's no, they won't be accepted. No one will listen to them at first, but then there's some new stuff will start to be dominant. So yeah, this is the Kuhn idea of scientific revolutions, but what interests us here is not so, we'll talk about evolution later, but what interests us here is this paradigm of heterosexual, normative heterosexual paradigms, because in a sphere of self-identification, this is still the paradigm that is leading one, that defines who we are, that defines the present society. Still, the heterosexual paradigm is this grand narrative that is the story we tell in each other and we tell in ourselves about who we are, the framework through which we define ourselves. It doesn't seem to us weird. This is established. We don't think it's weird to define what gender we are. We don't think it's weird to define what that we are a certain sexual orientation. We don't think that it's weird. One day it will, but still we persist in this framework, and we try to, and all our fight is really rare that it step outside of this this framework, because we tend to fight for emancipation of sexual identities, right? It's not the main agenda. So in that way, it's very tricky, because both the powers of liberation and powers of oppression are concentrated within the same framework. It's very hard to overthrow it, because our power of liberation, the most progressive powers, are still putting us within, keeping us within the framework of this meta-narrative framework of heterosexuality, even though it's homosexuality, as we were discussing. And I promise you not to show this time the continuum of reproduction, but I never promise you not to talk about it. So yeah, so what it has to do with continuum of reproduction is because if we define sexual thing, sex and desire for sex and sexual act as a key, and we see everything else as deviations from it, a deviation from heterosexuality. So homosexuality is not much better, because it still preserves something that it deviates from as central. So it's at the same time it fights the heterosexual normativity, but at the same time, by fighting with it, it kind of preserves it, establishes it as instance of as authority that it needs to overthrow. That's the problem. And there is such term as homonormativity, not only heterosexual normativity, but also homosexual normativity. So it still presupposes a certain kind of normativity within the sphere of sexual. So current paradigm is homosexual normativity. That's the reality we are born into, this power knowledge relationship, because once we are born, the first thing people want to know what gender we are, right? It doesn't seem weird to look at the genitals of a baby. The first thing you do when the human is born, you check out the genitals of a baby, and you come up and you announce what kind of human being the baby is after this important process. So that's the first. It's your life starts with. Your life starts with by you being you've been inscribed in the framework where you need to be, where your gender need to be defined, or where you, if you don't agree with it, or something, you have to choose your gender. Like it's obligatory almost process to think about it, who you want to be, and choose your sexual orientation. So this is the present framework, even though you can define yourself now as homosexual or other kind of LGBT. But still there is a kind of oppression from society that you have to do it. I mean, maybe even from yourself, from your the way you comprehend yourself, because the way you comprehend yourself is still the perspective imposed by society. So initially, the perspective of heterosexual normativity, this is something. So why, when you are born, you are your genitals are checked out and you are defined as a man and woman, because it's seen as the main as something. Well, previously it was seen within theological perspective as the God created people as man and woman, as Adam and Eve, and then it transformed within biological perspective, the same story with the same parameters of division people, idea of division people into basic categories of man and woman. And so it's not that nothing changed that much through with the appearance of more modern science. It's still about man and woman, still this still the theological story from the Bible, and the division on two sexes is still seen as natural, as this natural state of the world. And human are described normally. When we want to define human, we start to define them with starting with their gender, and reducing them to normally this oppositions of gender, and not doubting it, even though even in a context of feminism, when we try to emancipate. So even in the context of most progressive tendencies, we still don't doubt this this framework, this grand narrative. And for me, queer is actually the hope to step out of this discourse of sexuality, like see ourselves in a different way. So another so another perspective is, as I told you, the discourse of psychiatry, a medical discourse, is one of the most powerful today, because medical discourse is current authority. It's even as important probably as is previous times the church was. Church was its knowledge of the truth, with its authority of how we should lead your life, who we are, and this the center of generating and preserving and disseminating knowledge. Now probably this role is played by psychiatry, if it's about our psyche, and by medical discourse. Those are discourses that we trust, and in a contemporary world. But it's not everything is so perfect with them. They're not totally different in the way they function from the Christian religious perspective that just imposes certain idea, certain framework, and not certain ethical, cultural framework, not only medical knowledge. But this medical knowledge is not rarely exist in the framework of in a certain framework, dominant cultural framework, which is not the result of some research, but just sometimes just the bias, some cultural knowledge that is imposed. So one of the examples is that in DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, created by American Association of Psychiatry, American Psychiatric Association. It's called the Bible of Psychiatry. So it lists all the disorders, and homosexuality was actually described in it as the sexual orientation disturbance, that is as a mental disorder, until 1973. And it's very late, because we know that from 60s the active process of emancipation of sexuality was present. So we see that it's and even now in DSM, it's not that the fifth version, the newest version, is not that perfect as well, even though after some, as a result of social activism in 1973, APA, so the homosexuality was removed as the sexual orientation disturbance wasn't considered as a mental disorder anymore. As a result of it, this was demanded by activists. But still, this was kind of very late, and this shows that that the scientific discourse of psychiatry is still it's not perfect. It still have this feature of just imposing knowledge that is not exactly scientific knowledge in terms that it's objective truths, that it's just cultural knowledge sometimes. And also now it still preserves the fifth version. I think it still preserves something that not exactly that homosexual, not there's some homosexuality is sexual orientation disturbance, but there is entry that if it bothers you, your orientation, then it's it causes you distress, then it's a disorder. But the problem is that it might cause you distress, your orientation, because within the present framework, it's easier to live with a certain sexual orientation. Okay, so the other thing, wait a minute. Sorry for this. So to this, except for we already added, like, to understand what is a queer theory, we already talked about post-structuralists such as Foucault, bit about Deleuze, and the postmodernists, which normally is thought as something that includes post-structuralists, that is Foucault and Deleuze, Derrida. In explanation, what is a queer theory? We can also optionally add Freud to the queer theory, which is not so obvious as the adding Foucault, post-structuralists and postmodernists, but still. So Foucault is, Freud is optional here to use him to describe the methodology of queer theory, because as we know, as I told you, that's why you know, there is a friend, Freud, and enemy, Freud. So bad Freud and good Freud. Bad Freud, in meaning that he still preserves the heterosexual normativity. He still is the promoter of heterosexual normativity, because what he does, for him, the normal, first of all, he defines human beings through sexuality, like it's a key feature for him. And that's the idea, the framework that he promotes. And second of all, he promotes not only a framework of sexuality, but as crucial for defining human beings, but also he promotes heterosexuality, patriarchal heterosexuality, because man is so normal sexuality, he associates it with a mature man, right? Everything else is would be a deviation in comparison to this norm. That is, woman as a deviation, the pattern of psychosexual development is a deviation from the male pattern, right? But on the other hand, Freud is our friend and is, well, queer theory can be explained through his ideas in the sense that, and not apart from he was promoting heterosexual normativity, he was also the one who was questioning it, and one who was doubting it. And for example, his claim that children, infants are, they are sexual beings, but they are perverse beings, so polymorphously perverse, meaning super perverse in different ways. And the father psychoanalytic theory, including contemporary, you remember Alenka Zupancic, would claim that we never, even Freud already did, that we always preserve this initial infantile sexuality. So meaning that human sexuality is always perverse, is not natural. It's so it's culturally maybe defined. It's not coincide with the so it's detached from a certain natural instinctual sexuality, and it's transformed, modified. It's always remain in this unnatural form, in the perverse form. And although the goal of queer theory would be to establish those positive kind of understanding of certain processes that differ from the normative processes, not negative terms, because perversion is a negative term. Perversion means the deviation from the norm, right? And the queer theory want to actually establish certain terms, certain frameworks that would be seen not as certain processes, not in a negative form, but in a positive form. So perversion is not a good term for it, because it's negative, means perversion from what? From a norm, presupposing that norm is a basic initial. But I still like the term, even though it has connotation with sexuality, because when we think about perverts, we think that this is the sexual term. But I still like it, the way you remember Foucault was using it about perversion of common sense. And he was right, because Foucault, because as it turns out, the term pervert, perverten, initially didn't mean anything, didn't have to do with sex at all. It was about someone who steps aside from the right religious belief, so betrays the doctrine, a certain doctrine that is proclaimed to be truth. So it disturbed someone who distorts a natural order. And natural order, if you claim that perversion is a sexual term, the way it exists in the sphere of sexuality, it means unnatural sexual act, right? That, like, there is a natural sexual act and this is unnatural. So it's initially exist outside of, wasn't reduced to sexual behavior. It exists within religion as a, and defined perverts were people who just betrayed the initial, some doctrine that is proclaimed to be truth. But if you remember, so it's somehow similar to Kuhn's idea of Kuhn's idea of revolution, like someone who doubts it, establish discourse, mature discourse. They are seen weird, so they are perverts, right? But at the same time, by doubting it, by daring to doubt something that is proclaimed to be truth, and something that is forbidden to doubt within the present order, or is seen crazy to doubt this. They are perverts, but at the same time, by doubting it, they open up the space, or maybe simultaneously by doubting it, they create something new. or create the space for something, for some new perspective on a cause that they seem weird, on a cause that they seem as a perverts within the present order, within the established order. So that's the process that I see as a queering, that those are queers. I like actually the term queer, I mean pervert. So although the next slide, although the term queer was used throughout the history and was synonymous sometimes with perverts, but pervert is a stronger word. So queer was the synonymous with the word deviant for a long time. But as the term queer theory, first of all, it was a joke. It was used as in a joking form, like we would use now, for example, pervert form. So call someone perverts, or the pervert theory. That would be perceived as a joke, and in the same way, it was suggested as a term in 1991 during the conference in California. This term was suggested as a part of the conference by Teresa De Lauretis. She is Italian feminism and film theorist and feminist theorist. So she suggests the way in order to as a term to use at this conference, the term queer theory as a joke, but then it started to be a very serious thing. Well, not that serious, because it's still really quite new theory, and when the theory is quite new, it's not mature, and there are no those hierarchies, titles, and everything is more relaxed and fun than in already established discourses, like, for example, feminist discourse. Like, it's starting to get mature. So she suggests the term, and the whole thing of the conference, the whole goal of this conference was to articulate the terms in which lesbian, gay sexualities may be understood and imagined as form of resistance to cultural homogenization, contracting dominant discourse with other constructions of the object in culture. So the idea that it should be a term, some way to define those active forms of resistance to cultural homogenization, like with perverts, the active resistance. Not to define them as active resistance means to see them not only as negative, as deviants, as perverts, as something that by negating establish itself only as secondary to in comparison what it fights, but as active resistance, as a power of as the instance of generation of some forms of identification. But as we see, initially it appeared, the queer theory, it initially appeared within even this conference was about sexuality, was within the framework of sexuality, and it still largely persists in the framework of sexuality. Sometimes, we'll discuss it, sometimes it's used interchangeably with the concept of, with the term LGBT. Some people call it queer, and some people understand when they talk about queer, what they mean is LGBT. So it's still largely queer theory, still largely based on sexuality, but now in its contemporary variants, there is a discussion that it might be not about only sexual normativity, but like resistance to normativity is such, because talking about sex might be, or sexuality might be the core normativity, right? Not heterosexuality is normativity, but maybe sexuality as well. And just general information. So after the term was created in 1990, the mothers of queer theory, those people who are normally mentioned as mothers, but there are of course many others who work on it. But the earliest one and the key one are Judith Butler and Kosowski-Sendrick. that's what you will hear. So they mostly employ Foucault, following Foucault's perspective that we discussed, and they do remain more or less in a framework of sexuality. So this initial developments of queer theory, they remain within the framework of sexuality. And I would like to take a bit different path, and I have people to rely on, but let's first consider the term queer itself, because this is the definition that dictionaries will give you. So it still means odd, strange, weird. It still means eccentric, unconventional, questionable, suspicious, sick, unwell, mildly insane, within the perspective of medical discourse. It will be seen as the deviation. But you can also now find the addition that it is relating to or being a person whose sexual orientation is not heterosexual or cisgender. So now the new definition, it's kind of, I think it's a bit ruined the concept of gender, the concept of queer, by adding this. So this addition with this small words on the bottom, this one. So this addition, it's kind of, although it's modern interpretation of what is queer, right? And it's not negative anymore, unlike all of those terms, but I actually like all of those terms more than this reduction to a sphere of sexuality. I think there is more potentially those not negative terms like mildly insane and weird than in just reducing it and respectfully to the sphere of sexuality, where you have already have the idea of LGBT and stuff. So and queer in this way is even maybe in some way better than perversion, although I like both words. That shows you that in comparison to present order, in comparison to something established, mature, it seems as a deviation. It's weird, strange, odd, new, maybe bit sick within the normativity of mental health, what is considered to be normal. It's mildly insane, so not too insane so people won't listen, but just insane enough to talk and to exist in a present order. And the people I would like to rely in discussion of queer theory are Antonio Negri and Michael Hart. They are contemporary philosophers, and they don't actually develop or contribute in any elaborated way to queer theory. They just mention queer theory as something that resembles the most within the known concept, their idea, what they call monsters. So what they develop, they talk about monsters, but it's more, I like it more, I mean, queer theory in this interpretation as the monstrous, as something that they compare to their monsters. I like it more than it's than queer theory in interpretation of common interpretation that reduces it to a sphere of sexuality. So for Negri and Hart, the idea of monsters that they use and the image of monsters, claiming that monsters are real, they're not the part of our imagination. So monsters for them are those people tendencies, maybe they're not people anymore, those creatures within the present order, within established order, that are well, deviants, we can call them perverts, that it's that are seen within the present order as monstrous. But by this monstrosity, they actually hold the promise for some alternative, well, because it's not although they exist in present order, but they don't fully belong to a present order. So they are products of a present order, but they differ, and this difference is their monstrosity. And they talk about terata. Terata is medical term for a severely deformed fetus, right? It's contemporary medical term. Terata is for Greek, from Greek teras, means monster. And it's a great word because it's also means wonder, marvel. And from like Old Russian, Old Church, Slavonic, it also means chary, charm, charm. And it's from, there is also root that leads to idea that it's kver, to make, to form. So it's except for it means something terrible and monstrous, it's also means something wonderful. Wonder is also in Russian chuda, chare, chuda. It's also mean that it's something that's not supposed to happen in a present order, that it's some the stepping outside of a present order. So it's at the same time monstrous. It's not just not habitual. It's at the same time monstrous, at the same time marvelous, and at the same time it shows you that it's about formation. It's about process of formation. And later I will explain that it's not only about cultural sphere and the switch of paradigms, and present paradigm, mature paradigm, and the new paradigm that is seen as monstrous, weird, but also wonderful and generative and alive. But it's also about actually the biological evolution that is not opposite to this process. So not only monsters are cultural monsters that shift cultural revolutions, the understanding of the world, but also in a very reality of the biological reality. This also is formative power. The formative power is also monstrous in evolution, but a bit later. So the image they use is as example of those monsters that are deformed, kind of this image of deformed fetuses. The fetus, because it's born from the mother, it's a part, it resembles mother, it's a part of, so let's come back a bit. It's a part of a present order, but also it's because it's a deformed fetus. Fetus designates that it's a part of the present order, but because it's deformed, it also is not a part by this monstrosity. But it being deformed, it's also not part of a present order. So those monsters for Negri and Hart, they use the idea of the image of witches, which starting from 17th century, you know, that in Europe and in America, there was a witch hunt, and witches were like perverts, were women normally who doubt, who do some activities outside of the established doctrine, and what is considered to be normal, what is considered to be not sinful within the established doctrine. So because they were different, they were seen as evil. And now so witches means not only different and not only deviance from the established doctrine, but also as something wicked power, as some power of some evil power. And those are example of monsters, right? And contemporary witches, they claim a contemporary example of monster is, for example, a woman the creature who is defined as a woman within the present order, that is belongs by her appearance, for example, belongs to a present order, but she doesn't behave as a woman, right? She doesn't smile when it's appropriate for women to smile. She doesn't tend to provide this emotional work that women are expected to provide. So although she looks like a woman, she doesn't behave like a woman. And in this way, she's monstrous, right? Because she belongs to this order, maybe by her appearance, or through the present order define her as a woman. But there's something is wrong with her. She doesn't coincide exactly with how society defined her. So she might be defined as a woman, but she doesn't behave as a woman, and this is monstrous, right? But those monstrous revolution belongs to to monstrous, according to Negri and Hart. Monstrous revolution is monstrous because those features that are monstrous, that don't belong to present order, that are seen as terrible from the perspective of the present order, they hold the promise for alternative, for establishment of for moving towards the new order, or towards the transformation of established paradigm, adopting of established paradigm. So and we know that something that was weird for the previous order, like women who have rights, like this is weird, this is monstrous, because by definition women not supposed to have rights. So but revolution is monstrous, it's the weird process. And I also like, we still have time, I also like their distinction. So Negri and Hart criticize identity politics, which is very brave thing to do. Do you know what is identity politics? You don't. So it's identity politics when you on a basis of certain identity, may it be national identity or identity of a gender, or the identity of a class. You unite, define it as your identity, and you fight for your rights. And for them, Negri and Hart actually distinguish between emancipation and liberation, and claim they like liberation much more. They associate liberation with revolution, and they criticize identity politics, which they associate with emancipation. So identity politics, their criticism go to that are just emancipation, meaning that, for example, feminism is the identity mostly based on identity politics, meaning that liberate the group of people who associate themselves, identify themselves as a woman, as a woman. So for them, emancipation might be this process of where you identify yourself with a certain identity, like woman, race, class, and as a shared established identity, and you try to emancipate it. This is not exactly leads to revolution. It's not exactly revolutionist, because because first of all, this identity was formed in the present order, right? And the idea of emancipating, once you emancipate it, it will be empowered and it will start to be dominating, right? So they see emancipation. For this, they, for example, talk about feminist nationalism. They compare feminism with nationalism, that it's once it's the same principle of aiming to empowering, but once you empowered, you automatically start to be dominant, so nothing changed. But they see emancipation as a means for liberation, because liberation for them, it's more about process. It's not to freedom to be, it doesn't mean, it's not aimed to freedom to be who you really are, like to be a woman, but it's aimed to freedom to determine who you can be. It's more like a process, and they associate the liberation with the process of queering, right? You don't know who you are yet, or you preserve the space of monstrosity. Maybe you preserve the space of doubting whether you're a woman, who you can be, because woman is, for example, the category that is established in the present order, right? So it's will not change much, right? If you will be empowered, it's not exactly revolutionary. So they're okay with emancipation, with identity politics, only as far as they lead to liberation, only as far as they renounce themselves. So for example, when the woman writes, because it's very hard to lead liberation without accepting the terms that are imposed of you, like the term of woman. How would you, it's very hard to organize this process of emancipation, of liberation. So it might serve as a means for liberation, but only when it's abolished at the end. Only when it's simultaneously you are you have, if we talk about feminism, only simultaneously feminists will liberate, not only emancipate. When you are claiming that you are a woman and you identify yourself with a woman and with other group of people who present order identify with a woman, and so with the group of people that actually the present order grouped you with, you agree with that, but at the same time you preserve at least space of a doubt that maybe you don't know who you are, maybe you're something else, maybe there are other categories and other people to unite with, or other possibilities how you can be united with people, monstrous ones. So only to that extent it leads to liberation, only to the extent that identity politics are ready to renounce itself, it leads to a real liberation, that is freedom to determine who you can be. So for Hart and Negri, their idea of queer, they also criticize this reduction of queer to the sphere of sexuality, to identity politics, that it's normally seen as an analog synonym to LGBT. And this actually reduces their power, because they see queer as more as a process, not as a certain identity, like LGBT is already identity, or feminism presupposes the identity of a woman. But queer has this potential, revolutionary potential of monstrosity, because it can be seen for as long as it's seen as just a process of queering, as the process of desidentification, not identification yet, right? Not something established, but the process. And my personal favorite from them is the idea, as the big quote. So maybe this is the source why I think that this emancipation, liberation is traumatic and painful, one of the sources of me thinking that, because it's very painful to abolish your identity. So what they claim is, for real liberation, you have to abolish this identity, or at least, for example, identity of a woman, or at least because it is a part of the order you want to fight with, right? The order of past. And but it's comfortable to identify with it, because it's something comprehensible, it's something habitual, and it's very hard to abolish this identity, to see yourself as something new, to reveal yourself as a monstrous. So it's traumatic, right? Yes, Vladislav.
Yes, do I understand it right that the ultimate result of this process would be the acquisition of new identity, which could be transformed in the future? But finally, we need to have a stage where we can say, I am someone.
Yeah. Well, I don't actually agree with, I would be more radical than them. Because they claim that we need the process of, we need identity politics, but only as a means. So we need to claim that we are women, or we are working class, or we belong to certain nation. So we will start a process. We need to name ourselves from the perspective of the categories, using the categories that the present order will understand. But why? I mean, and then we have to abolish it at the end, once we won. But who will abolish it? Because you're going to be empowered, right? And why would you abolish it once you got empowered? You'll just persist. It's going to be just a bit different version of old order, right? Not the man but a woman, for example, or not certain country but the different country. It's still the bit modified, slightly modified, or version of old order. I think, but it's possible, don't know how exactly, but it's possible not to be defined in a process of emancipation by those categories that old order establishes, but just being weird. Do you have more question, or or you forgot to put the lower your hand?
Yeah, that's it.
Okay, so for Hart and Negri, this process is painful, but he warns that so this world that they imagine, the monstrous world, it's not that they imagine monsters are weird, it's not their imagination, they are there. So in the present order there are already the deviations of this order, those that points towards the alternative, those monstrous terata, the deformed fetuses and children. And in not only like other people, but in each of us, even though we are largely formed as part of the present order, but each of us keeps, there is a potential for the deformation, perversion, and well, transformation of the order. But it's painful because it's much easier to associate with the identity that was imposed on you, which is now normally sexual identity, that has something that has to do with sex or sexual identification. So, and you have a framework how you fight for your rights. And if you want to be progressive, and you also share it with a certain group of people who are progressive, and it's hard not to identify, not to participate in both of those processes. So not to identify yourself with none of them. It's traumatic. It's been weird. It's risk that you won't be identified, that you won't be listened to, because you can't even define yourself. You can't even start for the process of liberation, maybe. So it's painful, but at the same time, even though it's painful, they claim that revolution is for monsters, and you have to lose yourself to discover what you can be. So to discover this monster in yourself. So they're okay with us being in pain and going through traumatic and violent processes. So also what I promised to tell you is, don't have much time, but still, and I'm not a biologist, just like all in people in SAS, we are trying to combine different perspectives, but this is rare that people talk about it, but still, normally when we talk about queer, when we talk about postmodernism and stuff, and even in psychoanalytical theory, there is this bias, the idea that this queering and transformation and perversion only exist in a sphere of in a cultural sphere. So, for example, for Freud, and this more or less general perspective, for Freud, there is human reality. Humans are perverts. Humans are unnatural. They are so. There is something similar to queering here is going on. They're transformed. They're not reduced to nature, but there are animals and there is nature, which is natural. Like animals are natural. They have sex whenever they want to have sex. They are adapted. They are not weird. And you will see this idea everywhere, that queering is a cultural phenomena, and it's defined in opposition to a natural phenomena, which is nature is stable, nature really has two sexes or something like that, and something that is not modifiable. It's not true. Well, this perspective is not true. So there is no stable nature. You can see this queering, the process of queering as a basic for nature, the process of weird transformations, and this has to do with the devil that's supposed to save the queer instead of God. So already Deleuze, so contemporary comprehension of evolution is changing. It's not the evolution that it was before, not the Darwinian evolution anymore. it changing, and Deleuze, post-structuralist, postmodernist, actually predicted it, that it will start to be postmodernistic. It will abandon old schemas, and it will start to, well, it will be transformed into something more weird perspective or more weird worldview. And it's actually happening today. So Deleuze was right, even though he's not biologist. And for large, there is a big discourse going on to rethink evolution as a rhizome, the way Deleuze suggested it, instead of seeing it as a tree, the way it's all not normally seen. So it's some of the aspects that, if you want to do research in this, to pay attention to, if you want to queer evolution, is aimlessness of evolution. Because when Darwin came up with the idea of evolution, it was still largely defined within the old framework, old theological framework, that it has an aim, like theological Christian framework, that God created the world has two sexes, the world has a meaning, it has aim, we have to clean ourselves from sin, something like that. And humans are the best species because they resemble God and supposed to be masters of other species. So this story, although idea of evolution, it gets rid of a God, but it's not a radical rethinking. It's still based on this initial version framework, but not the contemporary concept of evolution. So contemporary, now we understand that there is no aim, that in evolution, even adaptation, survival is not the goal. Evolution has no goal, it's just aimless. And there is this good idea of term, Jade Goodall, whatever, Goodall's term, sprandles, that mean that the certain changes that are not adaptational changes, but just changes, these adaptations, weird stuff. And so some new features might be developed not as a result or with the aim of adaptation, but for just no reason. So what does it mean, those spandrels? The example is birds' wings. So wings were not developed in a course of evolution for the bird to fly. Wings were developed with a different, they initially served a different process of regulation of a temperature of a body of a certain previous species. And then later they was disadapted as those spandrels that serve different functions. They were adapted for flight. They were started to be used for flights. And this is how evolution works. So it's not adaptation, it's just changes. It's quite weird processes. Yes, Vladislav.
Yes, I wanted to clarify, is this example about the bird's wings called exaptation or not?
Yeah, it's called exaptation. Well, spandrels and exaptation are kind of the same thing. Yeah. Okay, so
yes, thank you.
So which means that it's queer, right? That's weird. That's not that something gets better and better, like we used to think in evolution, that only best species survive, only most adapted species survive, or only only species get more and more adapted to a certain for survival. It's not so. It's many weird phenomena that is happening in evolution, and evolution can be seen as queer process. And for example, already Darwin claimed that mutation are very important for evolution, and that we are not replicated exactly. We replicated with mutations, and those mutations are might be harmful and illogical, because if species survived in certain circumstances, certain surroundings, means that they are adopted for this surrounding. But then if they mutate, this mutation can cause some bad consequences, like disadaptation to a certain surrounding. But we still need this mutation to For example, if natural surrounding will change, some of the species will survive because they had those mutations, right? Because that might be disadaptations if nature surrounding wouldn't change. So mutations are important, and they might be seen as a main process and not only good mutation, but any mutation, because you never know what will happen. And also the hypothesis of hopeful monsters. Hopeful monsters is Gödel developed this idea with some other scientists. Hopeful monster meaning that for new species to appear, there's supposed to be some large-scale mutation. And hopeful because a large-scale mutation that leads to appearance of new species, so some radical transformation within the species. It's not enough accumulation of some small changes, some small mutations for new species for radical change to appear. There's supposed to be some large-scale mutation, but most of the large-scale, it's very risky. Large-scale mutations is highest risk for death, but maybe this hypothesis claimed that maybe some hopeful monsters nonetheless survived, and this is how we have different species, these radical transformations. And the other idea is idea of chimerism. Do you know who is chimera? Chimera, I'll show you. This is chimera. So in Russian is chimera. Chimera is the important contemporary phenomenon that is recognized as important in contemporary evolution. This is initially, chimera is ancient Greek god, ancient Greek monster that has the head of a lion, the body of goat, and the tail of sometimes a snake, sometimes dragon, as you can see here. And it plays a very important role, this understanding, very important role, this concept of chimerism in contemporary evolution, because we used to think, again, in following the teleological Christian perspective, that there is only the vertical so we pass our genes to our children, right? And this is the vertical process of passing those genes. But now, and we saw it as a main within the classical perspective of evolution, we saw it as a main process of how everything is organized. But now we know, for example, about the importance of vertical passing of information and the chimerism. So chimerism means that different species can be, so DNA of different species can be combined to form a certain, in a certain species. And now we know, for example, that there is viruses play, not only now, but we knew it for certain time, that viruses play quite a big role in formation of the species. And viruses is not a vertical passing of information, but it's doesn't need sexual reproduction, for example, to pass a certain information from one species to another species. Okay, we can discuss it more tomorrow because it's almost time. I have to let you go. And I suggest that I will tell you more about sexuality tomorrow, if you will have time, okay? So you'll have more rest instead of just me lecturing today, but if you want, I can proceed tomorrow. Or on Thursday, if you're going to have a presentation of Thursday, yeah? Switch the recording off.
Yes, probably you can proceed tomorrow.
Okay, good. If you want, I can tell you a bit more about the about evolution.
Our
Do you
presentations are
have
tomorrow,
questions?
right?
Yeah.